Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is a space where we discuss relationships, dating wisdom, and the realities that mature women face in the modern dating world. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that affects countless women, especially those of us who have lived enough life to know better, yet sometimes find ourselves caught off guard. We're talking about the wolf in sheep's clothing, the man who presents himself as a gentleman, but reveals himself to be anything but. Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. If you find value in this video, if anything I say resonates with you or helps you see your situation more clearly, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel reach more women who need to hear this message. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. Your stories help other women feel less alone. Don't forget to share this video with the women in your life who might benefit from this information. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our content. For those of you who want to go the extra mile in supporting this mission of empowering women with truth and wisdom, consider supporting the channel with super thanks. Your contribution helps us continue creating content that makes a real difference in women's lives. Now let's talk about something that's both uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. You've met him. He seemed perfect at first. Opened doors, pulled out chairs, and remembered your favorite flowers. He spoke eloquently about respect, values, and treating a woman right. He might have even criticized other men for their poor behavior toward women. On the surface, he appeared to be everything you'd been looking for. A real gentleman in a world where chivalry seems to have died, but something feels off. Maybe you can't quite put your finger on it yet. Perhaps it's just a nagging feeling in your gut. A small voice in the back of your mind whispering that things aren't quite adding up. Or maybe you've started noticing little inconsistencies, tiny cracks in the polished facade he's presented. Here's what I want you to understand right from the start. Your instincts are not wrong. That uncomfortable feeling you're experiencing. It's not paranoia. It's not you being overly critical or damaged from past relationships. It's your wisdom, your experience, and your intuition trying to protect you from something your conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. As mature women, we've lived through enough to have developed finely tuned radar for dishonesty and manipulation. But here's the tricky part. The men who are the most dangerous are often the ones who have also lived long enough to perfect their act. They've learned what women want to hear. They've studied what makes a good impression. They've practiced their performance until it's nearly flawless. Today we're going to examine 7 critical signs that the gentleman you think you found is actually nothing of the sort. These aren't just red flags. These are alarm bells, warning sirens, and flashing lights that should have you seriously reconsidering the relationship. Some of these signs might seem subtle at first, while others will hit you like a ton of bricks once you recognize them. But all of them are important, and all of them deserve your attention. I want to be clear about something before we dive in. This isn't about being cynical or distrustful of all men. There are genuine gentlemen out there. Men of character, integrity, and authentic kindness do exist. But part of recognizing the real deal is being able to identify the counterfeit. And unfortunately, the counterfeit version is often more common than we'd like to admit. The 7 signs we're about to discuss come from years of observations, countless stories from women who've been through these situations, and a deep understanding of human psychology and relationship dynamics. Each sign reveals something fundamental about a man's character, his true intentions, and whether he sees you as an equal partner, deserving of respect, or as someone to be used for his own purposes. As we go through each sign, I encourage you to be honest with yourself. Don't make excuses. Don't rationalize. Don't convince yourself that your situation is different, or that you can fix him, or that he'll change. Listen to what's being said with an open mind and a commitment to your own well-being. Remember, you've worked too hard, been through too much, and deserve too much to settle for someone who only pretends to be what you need. You don't need to waste another moment of your precious time on a man who isn't worthy of it. Your peace, your happiness, and your future are at stake, so let's get started. Here are the 7 signs he's not the gentleman you think he is. Older women, pay close attention. Sign number 1, his chivalry is performative and conditional. Let's talk about the first and perhaps most deceptive sign. His chivalry is performative and conditional. Now, what exactly does this mean? It means that his gentlemanly behavior isn't coming from a place of genuine respect and consideration for you as a person. Instead, it's a carefully constructed performance designed to achieve a specific outcome, and it only appears when certain conditions are met. A true gentleman behaves with courtesy and respect because it's who he is at his core. It's not something he turns on and off like a light switch. It's not dependent on his mood, what he wants from you, or who's watching. But the fake gentleman, his chivalry is strategic. It's a tool in his manipulation toolkit. And once you start paying attention, you'll notice the pattern. Think about it this way. When you first met him, he was the picture of perfection. He rushed to open every door. He insisted on walking on the street side of the sidewalk. He wouldn't let you lift a finger. He stood when you entered a room. He remembered every detail you shared with him. He texted you good morning and good night without fail. He made you feel like you were the center of his universe. It was intoxicating. It was exactly what you'd been hoping to find. But here's where it gets interesting. As time goes on, you start to notice that this behavior isn't consistent. It seems to intensify when he wants something from you. Maybe he's exceptionally attentive and chivalrous when he wants physical intimacy. Or perhaps his gentlemanly behavior reaches its peak when he needs a favor, when he's asking to borrow money, or when he wants you to do something for him that you've been hesitant about. You might also notice that his chivalry is very public. When you're out with friends, at a restaurant with other people around, or in any situation where others can witness his behavior, he's the absolute picture of a gentleman. But when it's just the two of you, alone in your home or his, the performance drops. The doors don't get opened quite as consistently. The sweet words dry up. The attentiveness fades. He's looking at his phone more than he's looking at you. The effort just isn't there anymore. This is performative chivalry, and it's one of the clearest signs that you're dealing with a man who's more interested in the image of being a gentleman than in actually being one. He wants others to see him as this wonderful, respectful man. He wants you to see him that way too, but only to the extent that it serves his purposes. The behavior isn't rooted in respect for you as a human being. It's rooted in what he can gain from maintaining this image. Let me give you a concrete example. Sarah, a woman in her late 50s, shared her story with me. She met Michael at a community event. He was charming, well-dressed, and exceptionally polite. On their first few dates, he was the perfect gentleman. He brought her flowers every time, opened every door, pulled out her chair, and made her feel absolutely cherished. Sarah felt like she'd finally met someone who would treat her the way she deserved, but after about 2 months, Sarah started noticing changes. Michael's gentlemanly behavior seemed to spike every Thursday, right before their standing Friday night date. The sweet text messages and phone calls would increase dramatically. He'd be extra attentive and romantic. Then she realized something. Friday nights were when they were usually intimate. His increased chivalry was directly correlated with his sexual desires. Even more telling, Sarah noticed that Michael was incredibly attentive when they were out with her friends or in public settings. He'd hold her hand, pull out her chair, and be the perfect companion. But at home, he'd barely look up from his phone. He'd make himself comfortable on her couch, expect her to serve him drinks and snacks, and show little interest in conversation. The gentleman disappeared the moment the audience did. This is what conditional chivalry looks like. It's not about respect. It's about manipulation. It's about creating an image and maintaining it only when it's beneficial to do so. A real gentleman doesn't need an audience. He doesn't turn his respect and consideration on and off based on what he hopes to get from you. His behavior is consistent because it flows from his character, not from his agenda. Pay attention to when his gentlemanly behavior appears and when it disappears. Is he more attentive when he wants something? Does his chivalry increase when you've expressed doubt about the relationship or when you've been less available to him? Does he perform for an audience but drop the act when you're alone? These are critical questions to ask yourself. Another aspect of performative chivalry is what I call the expectation factor. A genuine gentleman performs acts of kindness and courtesy without expecting anything in return. He doesn't keep score. He doesn't throw his good behavior back in your face during an argument. He doesn't use his chivalry as leverage or as a way to guilt you into doing what he wants. But the fake gentleman, he's keeping a very careful tally. He remembers every door he opened, every meal he paid for, and every kind gesture he made. And when you don't do what he wants, when you set a boundary or when you call him out on something, he'll bring up all these things. He'll say things like, "After everything I've done for you," or "I always treat you so well, and this is how you repay me." His chivalry comes with strings attached, with expectations, with a price tag that he'll present to you when it suits him. This transactional approach to kindness reveals his true mindset. He sees relationships as an exchange where his good behavior should buy him certain privileges, certain rights, or certain control over you. This isn't respect. This isn't genuine care. This is manipulation dressed up in a nice suit and holding a bouquet of flowers. I want you to understand something crucial. When a man truly respects you, his courteous behavior doesn't change based on circumstances. He doesn't become less of a gentleman because you've been dating for 6 months instead of 6 weeks. He doesn't drop the act because you're at home instead of at a fancy restaurant. He doesn't use his good behavior as a bargaining chip or as a way to control you. Consistency is the hallmark of authenticity. If his chivalry is real, it will be steady. It will be present in the mundane moments as well as the special occasions. It will exist in private as much as in public. It will continue even after the relationship has moved past the honeymoon phase, even after he's secured your commitment, even when he's in a bad mood or having a difficult day. Think about it in terms of kindness and consideration. Does he only help you with things when it's convenient for him, or when others can see him doing it? Is he compassionate and understanding when you're going through a difficult time? Or does his patience wear thin when your problems interfere with his plans? Does he respect your time, your opinions, and your boundaries consistently, or only when it benefits him to do so? These questions matter because they reveal whether you're dealing with genuine character or skillful acting. And here's something that might be hard to hear but needs to be said. If you're seeing signs of performative and conditional chivalry, it's unlikely to get better over time. In fact, it typically gets worse. The longer you're together, the less effort he'll put into the performance because he'll feel more secure in the relationship. The mask will slip more and more frequently until eventually, the gentleman you thought you knew will barely make appearances at all. You deserve someone whose respect for you isn't conditional. You deserve someone who treats you well not because of what he hopes to get from you, but because of who he is and who you are. You deserve authenticity, not performance. And if what you're getting is a show that only runs when the conditions are right, then it's time to close the curtain on that particular production and find someone whose kindness doesn't require an audience or a motive. As mature women, we've had enough experience to know the difference between genuine goodness and a well-rehearsed act. Trust that knowledge, trust your observations, and don't let the occasional bouquet of flowers or open door blind you to the pattern of conditional respect that underlies it all. Your intuition is telling you something important. Listen to it. Sign number 2, he love bombs you initially, then gradually withdraws. The second sign that he's not the gentleman you think he is involves a pattern that's become increasingly recognized, but is still often missed until it's too late. This is the cycle of love bombing followed by gradual withdrawal. If you've experienced this, you know how confusing and emotionally devastating it can be. If you haven't, understanding this pattern could save you from significant heartache down the road. Let's break down what love bombing actually means. It's not just being romantic or enthusiastic at the beginning of a relationship. Love bombing is an excessive, overwhelming display of affection, attention, and adoration that feels almost too good to be true. And here's the key point. It usually is too good to be true. When a man love bombs you, he comes on incredibly strong from the very start. We're talking constant communication throughout the day, every day. Extravagant compliments that go beyond normal appreciation. Grand gestures that seem over the top for how long you've actually known each other. Declarations of deep feelings way too soon in the relationship. Talk of a future together before you've really gotten to know each other. An intensity that sweeps you off your feet and makes you feel like you've found something magical. He tells you you're unlike any woman he's ever met. He says he's never felt this way before. He wants to spend every possible moment with you. He texts you from the moment he wakes up until he goes to bed. He plans elaborate dates. He showers you with gifts. He remembers every tiny detail you mention and acts on it. He integrates himself into your life at lightning speed, meeting your friends and family, making himself indispensable, and becoming the center of your world almost overnight. For many mature women, this kind of attention can be particularly seductive. Maybe you've been through a divorce or the loss of a spouse. Maybe you've been single for a while, navigating a dating world that often seems to have forgotten that women over a certain age exist. Maybe you've experienced relationships where you felt taken for granted or underappreciated. So when this man comes along and makes you feel seen, desired, valued, and cherished in such an intense way, it feels like everything you've been waiting for. But here's what you need to understand. Love bombing isn't love. It's a manipulation tactic. It's designed to create a powerful emotional bond very quickly, often before you have the chance to evaluate whether this person is actually right for you or to see who they really are beneath the performance. It bypasses your natural caution and critical thinking by overwhelming you with positive feelings and attention. The problem isn't just the love bombing itself, although that alone should raise questions. The real red flag is what comes after, because love bombing is always followed by withdrawal. Always. It's part of a predictable pattern that manipulative people use, whether consciously or unconsciously, to gain control in relationships. Here's how it typically unfolds. After weeks or months of this intense attention and affection, things start to change. At first, the changes are subtle. Maybe he doesn't text quite as frequently. Perhaps he's not as available as he used to be. He might seem a little distracted when you're together. The compliments come less often. The grand gestures slow down. The passion and intensity begin to cool. Initially, you might rationalize it. You tell yourself that the relationship is just settling into a more sustainable pace. After all, no one can maintain that level of intensity forever, right? You convince yourself that this is normal, that relationships naturally become less exciting as they become more stable. And to some extent, yes, the intense honeymoon phase does naturally evolve into something deeper and more sustainable in healthy relationships. But what you're experiencing isn't a natural evolution. It's a deliberate or subconscious withdrawal designed to create anxiety and make you work harder for the attention you were receiving so freely before. And this is where the manipulation really takes hold. As he pulls back, you find yourself pursuing him more. You reach out more often. You try harder to please him. You become more available, more accommodating, and more willing to overlook things that bother you. Why? Because you want to get back to that incredible feeling you had at the beginning. You want to recapture that magic. You want to feel the way he made you feel when he was love-bombing you. And you might even worry that you did something wrong, that somehow you're responsible for the change in his behavior. This is exactly where he wants you. Now you're off balance. Now you're working for his attention instead of him working for yours. Now he has the power in the relationship. The tables have completely turned and you might not even realize it happened. The withdrawal continues in cycles. He'll pull back, you'll pursue, and then occasionally he'll give you a taste of that initial intensity again. Just enough to keep you hooked. Just enough to make you think that things can get back to the way they were. Just enough to keep you trying. This intermittent reinforcement, where the reward comes unpredictably, is actually more powerful than consistent reward in creating addictive patterns of behavior. It's the same psychological principle that makes gambling so addictive. Let me share Patricia's story. Patricia was 62 when she met James on a dating app. James was everything she'd hoped for. From their very first conversation, he was attentive, complimentary, and deeply interested in everything about her. By the end of their first phone call, which lasted 3 hours, he told her he felt like he'd known her forever. Their first date was magical. James brought her a beautiful orchid because she'd mentioned in passing that she liked them. He planned the entire evening around things she'd said she enjoyed. He listened intently to everything she said, asked thoughtful questions, and made her feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. By the end of the date, he told her he hadn't felt this way since his wife passed away 15 years ago, and he didn't want to waste any more time at their age. He wanted to see where this could go. For the next 2 months, James was constant. He called her every morning and every evening. They saw each other 4 or 5 times a week. He introduced her to his children. He talked about traveling together, about their future. He told her she'd brought light back into his life. Patricia felt like she'd won the lottery. After years of lukewarm dates and men who seemed intimidated by her success and independence, James seemed to appreciate everything about her. Then gradually, things changed. James started being less available. His morning calls became text messages. Then the text messages became less frequent. When they were together, he seemed distracted. He was on his phone more. The deep conversations they used to have became more superficial. The romantic gestures stopped. Patricia felt confused and hurt, but when she tried to bring it up, James would reassure her that everything was fine. He was just dealing with some stress at work and with his adult children. Patricia found herself constantly checking her phone, waiting for his calls or texts. She started reaching out more, suggesting dates and making herself more available. She wondered what she'd done wrong. Had she been too needy? Too independent? Had she somehow scared him off? She bent over backward, trying to please him, to recapture what they'd had in those first magical weeks. What Patricia didn't realize until much later was that this was a pattern James repeated with women. The intense love bombing followed by withdrawal was his modus operandi. It kept women emotionally off balance and eager to please him. It gave him all the power in the relationship without him having to commit to genuine emotional intimacy or consistency. This pattern is particularly insidious with mature women for several reasons. First, as we get older, we often feel like time is precious. When someone comes along and seems to offer exactly what we've been looking for, we're more inclined to move quickly. We don't want to play games or waste time, so the fast pace of love bombing can seem like a positive thing, like someone who knows what they want and isn't afraid to go after it. Second, after years of life experience, we often feel confident in our ability to judge character. We think we can spot a player or a manipulator from a mile away. So when someone love bombs us, we might not see it as a red flag because we think our years of experience would have alerted us if something was off. This overconfidence in our judgment can make us more vulnerable, not less. Third, the withdrawal phase can trigger deep insecurities that many mature women carry. Insecurities about aging, about desirability, and about still being able to attract and keep a quality partner. When the intense attention suddenly decreases, it can feel like confirmation of our worst fears. We might work even harder to prove we're still valuable, still desirable, still worth the effort. We don't want to be difficult or demanding because we're afraid of driving him away completely. But here's what you need to know. If a man genuinely cares about you, his affection and attention will be consistent. Not constant and overwhelming like the love bombing phase, but steady and reliable. There will be a natural settling in as the relationship progresses, yes, but not a dramatic withdrawal. There won't be a cycle of intense attention followed by distance, followed by occasional crumbs of affection to keep you hooked. A real gentleman doesn't need to overwhelm you with attention at the beginning, because he understands that real connection takes time to build. He's not in a rush to lock you down or to create an intense emotional bond before you really know each other. He's confident enough in himself and in what he offers that he doesn't need to love bomb you. He's content to let the relationship develop naturally, at a pace that allows both of you to really see each other clearly. And crucially, a real gentleman doesn't play games with his attention. He doesn't pull back to make you chase him. He doesn't create anxiety to give himself power. He doesn't use intermittent reinforcement to keep you emotionally dependent on him. His care for you is demonstrated through consistent, reliable behavior, not through cycles of intensity and withdrawal. If you're in a situation where the man you're seeing came on incredibly strong at the beginning and has now pulled back, leaving you confused and trying to recapture what you initially had, I want you to take a step back and look at the pattern objectively. Ask yourself these questions. Was the initial intensity appropriate for how well we actually knew each other? Did he push for rapid progression in the relationship? Did he make big declarations and promises early on? Has his behavior become less consistent over time? Am I now putting in significantly more effort than I was at the beginning? Do I feel anxious about the relationship in a way I didn't before? If you're answering yes to most of these questions, you're likely dealing with a love bomber, and that's not a gentleman. That's someone who's manipulating you, whether consciously or unconsciously. And here's an important truth. It doesn't really matter whether he's doing it deliberately or whether it's just his dysfunctional pattern. The effect on you is the same either way. You cannot fix this pattern. You cannot love him enough, be patient enough, be understanding enough, or be perfect enough to make him return to being the man he was during the love bombing phase, because that man wasn't real. That was a performance, a mask, a role he played to hook you emotionally. The man you're seeing now, the one who's withdrawn and inconsistent, is closer to who he really is. I know this is hard to hear, especially if you're currently experiencing it. The hope that things will get back to how they were is powerful. The belief that if you just try hard enough, the magic will return is compelling. But that hope is keeping you trapped in a pattern that will only erode your self-esteem and waste your precious time. You deserve so much better than the emotional roller coaster of love bombing and withdrawal. You deserve someone who shows up consistently, who doesn't play games with your heart, and who builds trust through steady, reliable behavior rather than through overwhelming intensity followed by confusing distance. You deserve a man whose affection doesn't come in manipulative waves, but in steady, sustainable currents that you can count on. Please don't mistake intensity for intimacy. Don't confuse overwhelming attention for genuine love. And don't blame yourself when the love bomber inevitably withdraws. This is about his patterns, his issues, and his inability or unwillingness to show up as a consistent, emotionally healthy partner. It's not about your worth, your desirability, or your value. You are enough. You always were. And you deserve someone who sees that and treats you accordingly every single day, not just during the love bombing phase. Sign number 3. He speaks poorly of his ex-partners and other women. Third sign that the gentleman you think you've found isn't who he appears to be is one that many women overlook or rationalize, especially in the early stages of dating. This is when he speaks poorly of his ex-partners and other women in his life. Now, before you think I'm suggesting that everyone should only speak glowingly about their exes, let me clarify what I mean. There's a significant difference between honestly acknowledging that a past relationship didn't work out, or that there were conflicts and problems, versus consistently painting every woman from his past as crazy, unreasonable, vindictive, or problematic. When a man repeatedly badmouths his ex-wife, ex-girlfriends, or the women he's previously dated, it's not just idle conversation or harmless venting. It's revealing something crucial about how he views women, how he handles responsibility, and how he's likely to speak about you when your relationship inevitably encounters difficulties or, heaven forbid, ends. Let's start with the most common red flag in this category: the man who describes every one of his exes as crazy. You know this type. Every woman he's ever been with was apparently unstable, irrational, overly emotional, or mentally unwell. His ex-wife was crazy. His last girlfriend was crazy. The woman before that was also crazy. According to his narrative, he's been the perpetual victim of emotionally unstable women who made his life miserable through no fault of his own. Here's the reality that every mature woman needs to understand. When a man says all his exes were crazy, what he's really telling you is one of two things, or possibly both. First, he has terrible judgment when it comes to choosing partners, somehow repeatedly selecting deeply troubled women despite all evidence. Or second, and this is far more likely, he lacks self-awareness, refuses to take responsibility for his role in relationship problems, and labels any woman who calls him out on his behavior or who has emotional reactions to his treatment of her as crazy. Think about it logically for a moment. What are the odds that this one man has, through sheer misfortune, encountered nothing but unstable, irrational women in his romantic life? What are the chances that he bears absolutely no responsibility for any of the problems in any of his past relationships? It simply doesn't add up. But here's what does add up. Many men, especially those with narcissistic or manipulative tendencies, use the label crazy to dismiss, discredit, and avoid accountability for their own behavior. When a woman has a legitimate complaint about his treatment of her, he dismisses her as crazy. When a woman has an emotional reaction to being lied to, cheated on, or disrespected, he tells others she's crazy. When a woman sets boundaries or has expectations he doesn't want to meet, she's crazy. When a relationship ends because of his behavior, his infidelity, or his unwillingness to be a good partner, The story he tells afterward is that she was crazy and he had no choice but to leave. It's a convenient narrative that lets him off the hook while simultaneously lowering your defenses and setting you up to doubt your own perceptions when you eventually see his problematic behavior. Here's how it works in practice. He's telling you about his crazy ex. She accused him of cheating when he was just being friendly with other women. She got upset about little things that shouldn't have mattered. She was too sensitive and too demanding. She overreacted to things he did. She couldn't let things go. She was jealous for no reason. She started fights about nothing. She couldn't accept him for who he was. Do you see what's happening here? Every one of her complaints or concerns is being reframed as evidence of her irrationality rather than as potential evidence of his problematic behavior. He's training you to see any woman who has expectations, who expresses hurt or anger, who sets boundaries, or who calls out bad behavior as being unreasonable. He's setting up a situation where, when you eventually have your own complaints or concerns, you'll hesitate to voice them because you won't want to be labeled as crazy like all the women before you. This is particularly dangerous for mature women who have been through enough to know that relationships require communication about problems and who aren't afraid to speak up when something bothers them. You might have spent years developing the confidence and self-respect to set boundaries and to not tolerate disrespect. But when you're with a man who's already established that women who speak up are crazy, you'll find yourself second-guessing your own valid reactions. You'll wonder if you're overreacting. You'll worry about being too demanding. You'll hesitate to bring up issues because you don't want to be another crazy woman in his collection of stories. Let me tell you about Margaret's experience. Margaret, at 68, started dating Ronald, a man she met through a mutual friend. Ronald seemed thoughtful and mature, but almost immediately Margaret noticed that he had a lot to say about his ex-wife of 35 years. According to Ronald, his ex-wife had been impossible to live with. She was crazy, controlling, and made his life hell. She questioned where he was all the time. She got upset when he came home late. She didn't trust him. She nagged him constantly. She made mountains out of molehills. The divorce had been a relief, and he was just grateful to finally be free of her. Margaret felt sympathetic. She'd been through a difficult divorce herself. She understood that some relationships become toxic, and she appreciated that Ronald was being open about his past. But as time went on, she noticed that Ronald's criticisms weren't limited to his ex-wife. He spoke poorly of his daughter, calling her ungrateful and difficult. He criticized his female co-workers, describing them as incompetent and overly emotional. He had disdainful things to say about women in the news, women in his neighborhood, and women in general. Then Margaret started experiencing some of the same things Ronald's ex-wife had apparently complained about. Ronald was often late or would cancel plans at the last minute. When Margaret expressed disappointment, he told her she was being too rigid and needed to be more flexible. When she asked about his whereabouts when he was particularly late, he accused her of being controlling and said she reminded him of his ex-wife. When Margaret brought up concerns about his behavior, he told her she was overreacting and being too sensitive. Finally, Margaret realized the truth. Ronald's ex-wife probably wasn't crazy at all. She had likely been reacting to Ronald's inconsiderate, disrespectful behavior. Her nagging had probably been legitimate attempts to communicate about problems. Her trust issues had likely been based on actual reasons to be concerned. Her overreactions had probably been normal emotional responses to being treated poorly. Ronald had labeled her crazy to avoid taking responsibility for his own actions, and he was now doing the same thing to Margaret. This pattern of speaking poorly about ex-partners often extends beyond just romantic relationships. Pay attention to how a man speaks about women in general. Does he make dismissive comments about women drivers, women leaders, or women in his workplace? Does he use gendered slurs casually? Does he stereotype women as being too emotional, too sensitive, or too dramatic? Does he have a general attitude that women are less rational, less capable, or less valuable than men? A true gentleman has respect for women that extends beyond just the woman he's currently trying to impress. He doesn't need to put down other women to make you feel special. He doesn't have a trail of ex-partners he describes in entirely negative terms. He can acknowledge that past relationships didn't work out without making it seem like every woman he's ever been with was deficient in some way. A mature, emotionally healthy man can talk about past relationships with nuance. He can acknowledge that there were problems on both sides. He can admit to his own mistakes and shortcomings. He can describe his ex-partners as decent human beings who simply weren't the right match for him or with whom he had incompatibilities or conflicts that couldn't be resolved. He doesn't need to make them into villains to explain why the relationship ended. Moreover, a real gentleman understands that it's disrespectful to you to constantly badmouth other women, including his exes. He recognizes that it makes you uncomfortable. He understands that it reveals poor character. He knows that you're probably wondering what he'll say about you if things don't work out. A man with genuine class doesn't air his dirty laundry or trash talk the women who've been in his life, even if those relationships ended badly. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying that a man should never say anything negative about a past relationship or that every complaint about an ex is a red flag. Sometimes relationships end badly. Sometimes there are legitimate grievances. Sometimes an ex-partner truly did behave poorly. The key is in the pattern and the nature of the complaints. If a man says his last relationship ended because they had different goals for the future, or because they couldn't resolve certain conflicts, or because they realized they weren't compatible, that's reasonable. If he mentions that his ex-wife had an affair and that's why they divorced, that's a statement of fact about why the marriage ended. If he says that his last girlfriend struggled with addiction and he couldn't continue the relationship, that's explaining a legitimate deal breaker. But if every story about an ex paints her as entirely at fault, entirely crazy and entirely problematic, while he remains the innocent victim or the long-suffering saint who tried his best, that's a red flag. If he uses degrading language to describe women from his past, that's a red flag. If he seems to enjoy telling stories that make his exes look bad, that's a red flag. If he shows no capacity for self-reflection about what role he might have played in the dysfunction of past relationships, that's a red flag. And here's something crucial that many women don't consider. How a man speaks about his ex-partners when you first start dating is exactly how he'll speak about you to the next woman if your relationship doesn't work out. Those stories he's telling you about his crazy, demanding, unreasonable ex, you'll be the star of the next version of those stories. Everything you say, every concern you raise, and every emotion you express will be repackaged into evidence of your unreasonableness when he's trying to impress the next woman he dates. This matters for another reason too. When a man constantly badmouths his exes, he's revealing that he doesn't take responsibility for his part in relationship problems. This means he's unlikely to do the work required to be a good partner to you. If he hasn't learned from past relationship failures because he doesn't believe he contributed to them, he's going to repeat the same patterns with you. He's not going to grow, change, or improve because in his mind he doesn't need to. The problem was always with them, never with him. Furthermore, speaking poorly of exes often indicates an inability to achieve closure and move on from past relationships in a healthy way. A man who is truly ready for a new relationship has processed his past relationships, learned from them, made peace with how they ended, and moved forward. He isn't still angry. He isn't still bitter. He isn't still nursing grievances or feeling like a victim. He's done the emotional work necessary to be fully present with you, rather than still fighting battles from his past. When a man is still intensely focused on how wronged he was by his exes, part of his emotional energy is still tied up in those past relationships. He's not fully available for a new healthy relationship with you. His ongoing resentment is a sign that he hasn't healed, hasn't grown, and isn't ready to be the partner you deserve. So what should you listen for? Pay attention to how he describes his relationship history. Listen to the language he uses when talking about ex-partners. Notice whether he can acknowledge any fault on his part or whether he positions himself purely as a victim. Observe how he speaks about women in general, not just romantic partners. Watch for whether he shows respect for women as human beings or whether there's an underlying current of disrespect, dismissiveness, or disdain. And trust your gut. If his stories about exes make you uncomfortable, if they ring alarm bells, if they make you wonder what he'll say about you someday, that discomfort is your wisdom speaking. Listen to it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't convince yourself that you're different or that he won't treat you the way he treated them. Don't believe that you'll be the exception to his pattern, because here's the hard truth. You won't be. If he spoke poorly of every woman before you, he'll speak poorly of you too. If he blamed all of them for relationship problems, he'll blame you too. If he called them crazy for having legitimate concerns, he'll call you crazy too. If he showed no respect for them once the relationship ended, he won't respect you either. You deserve a man who speaks about his past with maturity and respect. You deserve someone who owns his mistakes, who learns from his failures, and who treats his exes with basic human dignity, even if the relationship didn't work out. You deserve a partner who doesn't need to tear down other women to build you up, who doesn't have a collection of stories about crazy exes, and who doesn't reveal through his words that he fundamentally lacks respect for women. Don't ignore this sign. Don't excuse it. Don't pretend it doesn't matter. Because how a man speaks about the women from his past is one of the clearest predictors of how he'll treat you and speak about you in the future. Listen to what he's telling you about who he really is, and believe him. Sign number 4, he isolates you from your support system. We've reached the 4th sign that the gentleman you think you've met isn't who he appears to be. And this one is particularly serious because it directly impacts your safety, your well-being, and your ability to see the relationship clearly. This sign is when he begins to isolate you from your support system, your friends, your family, and the other connections that make up your life outside of him. Now, isolation doesn't usually happen all at once or in an obvious way. It's rarely a case of a man saying outright, "I don't want you to see your friends anymore," or "You need to choose between your family and me," although in extreme cases that can happen. More often, the isolation happens gradually, subtly through a series of small actions and manipulations that you might not even recognize as isolation, until you're already significantly cut off from the people who care about you. Understanding how and why manipulative men isolate their partners is crucial, especially for mature women who have established lives, friendships, and family connections. When you've lived for several decades, you've likely built up a support network of people who know you well, who care about your well-being, and who would notice if something was wrong. These are the very people that a manipulative man sees as threats to his control over you. Your friends and family can see things you can't see when you're caught up in the relationship. They can provide perspective, advice, and support. They can help you leave if the relationship becomes unhealthy. And that's exactly why he wants them out of the picture. So how does this isolation begin? Let's look at the subtle tactics that manipulative men use. One of the most common approaches is what I call the them or me comparison. He might not directly tell you to stop seeing your friends, but he'll express hurt or disappointment whenever you choose to spend time with them instead of with him. He'll say things like, "I thought you'd want to spend your free time with me," or "Don't you enjoy being with me?" Or, "I guess I'm not as important to you as I thought." This creates guilt. You start to feel bad about wanting to maintain your other relationships. You feel like you're hurting him or disappointing him by having a life outside of your relationship with him. So gradually you start turning down invitations from friends. You see your family less often. You skip the book club meetings or the yoga class or the volunteer work you used to enjoy. And each time you do, he rewards you with approval and affection, reinforcing the behavior of choosing him over everything and everyone else. Another tactic is criticism and disdain for the important people in your life. He'll make negative comments about your friends. "She seems kind of shallow, doesn't she?" Or, "I don't understand why you spend so much time with her. What do you even have in common?" He might suggest that your friends are jealous of your happiness, that they're trying to sabotage your relationship, or that they don't have your best interests at heart. With family, he might be more careful initially, but eventually he'll start creating problems there too. He might say your daughter is too involved in your business. He might suggest that your sister is controlling. He might imply that your friends from church are judgmental. He'll plant seeds of doubt about the people who care about you, making you question whether they're really good for you or whether they're actually holding you back or causing unnecessary stress in your life. Let me share with you Barbara's experience because it illustrates this pattern so clearly. Barbara was 63 when she met Thomas at a community center event. Thomas was attentive, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in her life. Barbara had a close-knit group of 3 friends she'd known for over 20 years. They met for lunch every week and took a weekend trip together twice a year. She was also close with her adult children and grandchildren, seeing them regularly. At first, Thomas seemed supportive of Barbara's relationships. He'd ask about her friends and her family. But gradually things changed. When Barbara would mention her weekly lunch with her friends, Thomas would look disappointed. "I was hoping we could have lunch together," he'd say, "but I guess your friends are more important." Barbara would feel guilty and would reassure him that he was very important to her. Then Thomas started making small criticisms. He'd say that one of her friends talked too much about herself. He'd suggest that another friend seemed to drink too much wine at lunch. He'd hint that the third friend was going through some personal problems and might be a negative influence. None of these observations were entirely baseless, which made them more insidious. Barbara started to see her friends through Thomas's critical lens and began to feel less enthusiastic about their get-togethers. Thomas also began to have conflicts with Barbara's family. He felt her daughter was too protective and interfering. He thought her son didn't respect him. He found her grandchildren's visits exhausting and would get irritable when they came over. Gradually, Barbara found herself seeing her family less often, making excuses for why she couldn't host the Sunday dinners she used to love, and pulling back from being as involved with her grandchildren as she had been. Without fully realizing it, Barbara had become increasingly isolated. Her world had shrunk to primarily just Thomas. When problems in the relationship began to emerge, Barbara had no one to talk to about them. Her friends had drifted away, hurt by how she'd pulled back from them. Her family was concerned but hesitant to intervene because Barbara had been defensive when they'd expressed concerns about Thomas. Barbara was alone, which was exactly where Thomas wanted her. This isolation serves multiple purposes for the manipulative man. First, it removes outside perspectives that might help you see his behavior clearly. When you're isolated, you only have his version of reality. You can't reality check your experiences with people who care about you and who might say, "What he did wasn't okay," or "That's not normal relationship behavior." Second, isolation makes you more dependent on him emotionally. When he's your primary or only source of companionship, support, and social interaction, you become much more invested in maintaining the relationship, even if it's unhealthy. The fear of being alone becomes overwhelming when you've allowed your other connections to wither. Third, isolation reduces your resources if you need to leave the relationship. If you've distanced yourself from friends and family, where will you go if things get bad? Who will you turn to for support? The manipulative man knows that by isolating you, he's making it much harder for you to leave him, even if you want to. Fourth, isolation allows his manipulation and possibly abuse to escalate without witnesses. If you're not regularly seeing people who know you well, no one notices if you're losing weight, seeming depressed, or showing signs of being in an unhealthy relationship. There's no one to sound the alarm or to intervene. It's worth noting that isolation can also extend beyond just your personal relationships. A manipulative man might also try to separate you from other aspects of your independent life. He might discourage you from working or suggest you should retire early. He might criticize your hobbies or interests and make you feel silly for pursuing them. He might monopolize your time so completely that you have no space for activities that don't involve him. He might want access to all your finances so you become financially dependent on him. All of these are forms of isolation that reduce your autonomy and increase his control. One particularly insidious aspect of isolation is that it often feels loving at first. He wants to spend all his time with you. He wants to be involved in everything you do. He wants you to be his whole world, and he wants to be yours. For women who might have felt lonely or undervalued in past relationships, this intense focus can feel wonderful. It can seem like the deep connection you've been looking for. But there's a crucial difference between healthy togetherness and unhealthy enmeshment. In a healthy relationship, you enjoy spending time together, but you also value and support each other's outside relationships and interests. You understand that having a life outside the relationship makes you both more interesting and fulfilled individuals, which strengthens rather than weakens your connection. You trust each other enough to not need constant togetherness. You're secure enough to not feel threatened by your partner having other important relationships. In contrast, the unhealthy togetherness of isolation is based on insecurity, control, and possessiveness, even if it's dressed up as love. It's not about wanting to be with you because he enjoys your company. It's about not wanting you to be with anyone else because they might influence you in ways he can't control. It's not about loving you so much that he can't get enough of you. It's about keeping you dependent and isolated so he can control the narrative of your relationship. So how can you tell the difference? How can you know if you're experiencing healthy closeness or unhealthy isolation? Ask yourself these questions. Does he support your friendships and family relationships, or does he create conflict around them? Does he encourage your interests and hobbies, or does he make you feel guilty for pursuing them? Do you feel free to maintain your independent life, or do you feel pressure to center your life entirely around him? Has your world become smaller since you've been with him, or has it remained vibrant and full? Also, pay attention to how you feel. Do you feel guilty when you want to spend time with friends? Do you find yourself making excuses for not seeing family? Do you feel like you have to choose between him and the other people you care about? Do you feel anxious about how he'll react if you make plans that don't include him? These feelings are red flags that isolation might be happening. It's also crucial to listen to your friends and family if they express concerns. One of the most common things I hear from women who've been in isolating relationships is, "Looking back, I wish I'd listened when my friends and family tried to tell me something was wrong." It's hard to hear criticism of someone you care about, especially when you're in the honeymoon phase or when you've been convinced that your loved ones don't understand your relationship. But people who've known you for years, who love you, and who have your best interest at heart, are often seeing things more clearly than you can from inside the relationship. If your friends and family are expressing concerns, don't dismiss them automatically. Don't let him convince you that they're jealous, interfering, or don't understand. Take their concerns seriously. Listen to specific examples they provide. Consider whether there might be truth in what they're saying, even if it's difficult to hear. And here's something really important for mature women to understand. You've lived long enough to have built a life, a support system, and an identity independent of any romantic relationship. Those things are valuable. They're not obstacles to a good relationship. They're assets. A good man, a real gentleman, will appreciate that you have a full life. He'll be glad that you have people who care about you. He'll want to enhance your life, not replace everything in it. If a man requires you to diminish your life to fit into his, he's not a gentleman. If he sees your friends and family as competition, rather than as part of the package of who you are, he's not secure enough to be a good partner. If he needs to isolate you to feel important in your life, he doesn't actually value you as a complete, complex person with needs beyond just the relationship with him. Don't let anyone, no matter how charming or how much they claim to love you, convince you to give up the connections and activities that make your life rich and meaningful. Don't sacrifice your relationships on the altar of a romantic relationship, especially one that's still new and unproven. Maintain your friendships. Stay close to your family. Keep up with your hobbies and interests. Preserve your independence. If the man you're with has a problem with you maintaining a life outside of your relationship with him, that's not love. That's control. And if he's trying to isolate you, whether subtly or obviously, that's not the behavior of a gentleman. That's the behavior of someone who knows that if you maintain your connections to people who genuinely care about you, they'll eventually help you see him for who he really is. Your support system isn't an obstacle to love. It's a safety net, a source of joy, and a crucial part of who you are. Any man worth your time will understand that and will never ask you to give it up. Sign number 5. He's financially manipulative. or takes advantage. The fifth sign that he's not the gentleman you think he is strikes at something that's particularly important for mature women to protect: financial security and independence. Financial manipulation and taking advantage of a partner's resources is one of the most damaging and often overlooked red flags in relationships. Many women don't realize they're being financially exploited until significant damage has been done. And for older women who may be on fixed incomes or who have spent years building their financial security, the impact can be devastating. Financial manipulation can take many forms, ranging from subtle to overt, but all of them share a common goal: to access, control, or benefit from your financial resources without offering equivalent contribution or value in return. Let's explore the various ways this manifests and why it's such a serious concern. One of the most common patterns is what I call the slow slide into dependence. This is when a man gradually begins relying on you financially in ways that start small but steadily increase. It might begin innocently enough. Maybe he forgot his wallet when you went to dinner, so you paid. No big deal, right? These things happen. But then it happens again and again. Soon you realize you've paid for the last 6 meals you've had together, or perhaps he mentions that he's having a temporary cash flow problem. His pension didn't come through on time, or he had an unexpected expense, or his investment hasn't paid out yet. Could you spot him some money just until next week? Of course you can. You care about him, and you don't want him to be in a tight spot. Next week comes, and there's another reason why he can't pay you back quite yet. Then another reason. Eventually, you stop expecting to be paid back, and somehow your financial support of him has become the norm rather than the exception. Let me be very clear about something. A real gentleman would be mortified to repeatedly rely on a woman's financial support. He would go out of his way to ensure that he's contributing equally or at least proportionally to the relationship. He would be transparent about his financial situation from the beginning. He would never make promises to pay you back with no intention of doing so. He would recognize that your financial resources represent your security, your independence, and years of your hard work, and he would treat that with respect. The financial manipulator, on the other hand, operates very differently. He sees your financial resources as something he's entitled to access. He creates situations where you end up paying more than your fair share. He makes his financial problems your responsibility, and he often uses emotional manipulation to make you feel like you're being unsupportive, unloving, or selfish if you hesitate to help him financially. Let me share Dorothy's story because it perfectly illustrates how insidious financial manipulation can be. Dorothy was 67, a retired teacher with a modest but secure pension and savings. She met Richard, who claimed to be a successful consultant. Richard was charming, well-dressed, and seemed financially comfortable. He talked about his investments, his business ventures, and his properties. In the first month of dating, Richard always paid for their dates. He insisted on it, saying he was old-fashioned, and it was his pleasure to treat her. Dorothy was impressed and touched by his generosity. But in the second month, things started to change. Richard mentioned that one of his business deals was taking longer to close than expected, and his liquid cash was temporarily tied up. Would Dorothy mind covering dinner this time? He'd get the next several to make up for it. We've arrived at sign number 6, and this one is critically important because it gets to the heart of character and integrity. This sign is when his words and actions don't align. In other words, what he says and what he does are two completely different things. He talks a good game, but he doesn't follow through. He makes promises he doesn't keep. He says one thing and does another. And this misalignment between words and actions is one of the clearest indicators that you're not dealing with a real gentleman, no matter how convincing his words might be. As mature women with life experience, we understand that actions speak louder than words. We know that anyone can say anything. Saying the right things is easy. Promising to be there, to be faithful, to be supportive, and to treat you like a queen costs nothing. But actually following through, actually being consistent, actually backing up those words with behavior, that's where character reveals itself. And that's where the fake gentleman falls short every single time. Let me explain why this particular sign is so insidious. When you're in the early stages of getting to know someone, you're naturally listening to what they tell you about themselves. You're hearing about their values, their priorities, their past, their goals, and their intentions toward you. And if someone tells you consistently that they're honest, that they value loyalty, that family is important to them, that they're looking for a serious relationship, and that they'll always be there for you, you want to believe them, especially if they're saying all the things you've been hoping to hear. But here's the truth that you need to internalize. Anyone can claim to be anything. Words are cheap. They require no proof, no demonstration, no sacrifice. A man can tell you he's the most honest person you'll ever meet while lying through his teeth. He can tell you he values commitment while actively keeping his options open. He can tell you he respects women while treating you with subtle disrespect. He can tell you you're his priority while consistently prioritizing everything and everyone else. This is why you must, absolutely must, pay more attention to what a man does than to what he says. His behavior is the truth. His actions reveal his real values, his real priorities, and his real character. And when there's a disconnect between his words and his actions, you need to believe the actions every single time. Let's look at some common areas where this misalignment shows up. One of the most frequent is in the area of commitment and follow-through. He tells you he'll call at a certain time, but doesn't. He makes plans with you, but cancels at the last minute or doesn't show up. He says he's going to do something to help you, but never gets around to it. He promises to introduce you to his friends or family, but months go by without it happening. He talks about a future together, but takes no concrete steps toward building that future. Each individual instance might seem minor. So he didn't call when he said he would. So he had to cancel dinner plans. So he forgot to do that thing he promised. You make excuses for him. He was busy. Something came up, he forgot. It's not a big deal. But when you step back and look at the pattern, you realize that his words consistently don't match his actions. He's all talk and no follow-through. This pattern reveals something fundamental about him. It shows that his word doesn't mean anything. It demonstrates that he doesn't value your time or your feelings enough to honor his commitments to you. It indicates that he's either disorganized and unreliable, or more likely, that he's deliberately making promises he has no intention of keeping to manage your expectations and keep you engaged while he does what he actually wants to do. Let me tell you about Helen's experience. Helen, at 71, met Frank through an online dating site. Frank presented himself as a devoted family man, recently widowed, who valued honesty and communication above all else. He talked at length about how important it was to him to find someone he could trust completely and build a life with. He said he'd been deeply hurt by dishonesty in the past and would never treat someone he cared about with anything less than complete transparency. Helen was impressed by Frank's apparent values and his emotional depth. Their early conversations were wonderful. Frank called when he said he would. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. He talked about introducing her to his adult children and grandchildren, about taking trips together, and about sharing their lives. But as time went on, Helen began to notice discrepancies. Frank would say he'd call at 7 but wouldn't call until 9 or 10, if at all. He'd make plans for the weekend and then cancel, often at the last minute, with vague explanations. He talked constantly about Helen meeting his family, but months passed without it happening. Whenever Helen would bring it up, he'd have a reason why now wasn't the right time. But soon, very soon. Most troubling, Helen began to notice that some of Frank's stories didn't quite add up. Details would change from one telling to another. Things he'd said about his past didn't match with things she learned later. When she gently questioned these inconsistencies, Frank would get defensive or turn it around on her, suggesting she'd misunderstood or misremembered. Eventually, Helen discovered that Frank had been far from honest. He was still legally married, though separated. He had significant debt he'd never mentioned. He'd been seeing other women while also dating Helen. The devoted family man who valued honesty above all else had been lying about nearly everything of importance. His words and his actions had been completely misaligned, but Helen had been so focused on his beautiful words that she'd initially given him the benefit of the doubt on the behavioral red flags Another common area of misalignment is in how a man treats you in different contexts. He might tell you that you're special to him, that you're his priority, and that he values you more than anything. But then, when it comes to actual choices and actions, you're consistently at the bottom of his priority list. He cancels plans with you when something else comes up. He's unavailable when you need support. He doesn't make time for you. He doesn't consider your needs or preferences when making decisions. Or perhaps he tells you he respects you and values your opinion. But when you express a different viewpoint, he dismisses you, talks over you, or makes you feel stupid for your perspective. He says he wants an equal partnership, but he expects you to accommodate his schedule, his preferences, and his needs while showing little reciprocal flexibility or consideration for yours. This kind of misalignment is particularly damaging because it creates confusion and self-doubt. You hear one message in his words and receive a completely different message from his behavior, and your mind struggles to reconcile the two. Often, we want so badly to believe the words that we dismiss the actions, at least initially. We make excuses. We give him the benefit of the doubt. We convince ourselves that the behavior doesn't really represent how he feels. But here's what you need to understand. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them. Don't wait for the actions to match the pretty words. Don't convince yourself that eventually he'll start backing up what he says with what he does. The behavior is the truth. The words are the con. A real gentleman doesn't have a gap between his words and his actions because his words flow from who he actually is, not from who he's pretending to be. If he says he'll call, he calls. If he makes plans, he keeps them. If he makes a promise, he honors it. If he says you matter to him, his behavior demonstrates it. If he claims to have certain values, he lives by those values. He doesn't need to constantly tell you about his great character because his character is evident in everything he does. Moreover, a man of genuine integrity will be horrified if you point out an inconsistency between what he said and what he did. He'll apologize, take responsibility, and work to ensure it doesn't happen again. He won't get defensive or make excuses or turn it around on you. He'll recognize that following through on his word matters, and he'll do better. In contrast, the man whose words and actions routinely don't align will have an excuse for everything. He'll minimize the importance of his broken promises. He'll suggest you're being too sensitive or too demanding. He'll deflect by bringing up something you did wrong. He'll promise to do better but never actually change. Because doing better would require him to actually become the person he's been claiming to be, and he has no intention of doing that. The act serves his purposes. The reality would require too much of him. Let me give you another specific example of this misalignment. Consider the man who talks about how much he values family and relationships, who tells stories about how close he is to his children and grandchildren, and who says that family comes first for him. But then when you observe his actual interactions with his family, you notice he's often critical of them. He doesn't make time for them unless it's convenient for him, and he talks about them differently when they're not around. His behavior toward his family doesn't match his words about valuing them. Why does this matter for your relationship with him? Because if he doesn't actually treat his family the way he claims to value them, he's not going to treat you any better in the long run. If he can talk beautifully about family values while behaving inconsistently with those values, he can do the same thing with you. The gap between words and actions reveals a deeper dishonesty or self-delusion that will inevitably affect your relationship too. The same principle applies to how he talks about other values. If he constantly says he values honesty but you catch him in lies, even small ones believe the lies, not the declarations of honesty. If he talks about being financially responsible but his behavior shows he's reckless with money, believe the behavior. If he says he's over his ex, but he can't stop talking about her, or he's still in regular contact beyond what's necessary for legitimate reasons, believe the behavior. This misalignment often extends to how he talks about the relationship itself. He might tell you you're in an exclusive, committed relationship, but he's still active on dating sites. He might say you're partners, but he makes major decisions without consulting you. He might claim to be working toward a future together, but he's not actually taking any steps to build that future. One particularly troubling form of this misalignment is when a man says all the right things about respect, equality, and partnership, but his behavior reveals that he sees the relationship as something that should primarily serve his needs. He expects you to be flexible for him, but isn't flexible for you. He expects you to support his goals, but shows little interest in yours. He expects you to accommodate his preferences, his schedule, his friends, and his way of doing things, but he's resistant to reciprocating. As mature women, many of us have been socialized to be understanding, to be patient, to not make a fuss, and to give people the benefit of the doubt. We don't want to be perceived as difficult or demanding. We don't want to seem distrustful. So when we notice that someone's actions aren't matching their words, we often hesitate to call it out or to take it seriously. We tell ourselves we're overthinking it or being too judgmental. But I want to encourage you to trust yourself. Trust your observations. If you're noticing a pattern where his words and actions don't align, you're not imagining it. You're not being too picky. You're not expecting too much. You're simply observing reality and having the wisdom to recognize that something is off. Here's a practical exercise I want you to do if you're currently in a relationship or if you're evaluating someone you're dating. Make 2 lists. On one list, write down what he's told you about himself, about his values, about his feelings for you, and about his intentions in the relationship. Be specific. Include his promises, his declarations, and his stated priorities. On the second list, write down what his actual behavior demonstrates. What does he actually do? How does he actually treat you? What do his choices and actions reveal about his real priorities? Where is his time actually going? What has he actually followed through on? Now compare the 2 lists. Where they align, that's good. That's consistency. That's authenticity. But where they don't align, where there are gaps or contradictions, those are your red flags. Those discrepancies tell you something important. They tell you that this person is either deceiving you or deceiving himself about who he is and what he's offering. And here's the crucial question to ask yourself. Are the misalignments getting better or worse over time? Is he working to close the gap between his words and actions, or is the gap widening? Because if months into the relationship the misalignment is as bad or worse than it was at the beginning, that's telling you this is who he is. This is the relationship you'll have with him. Don't wait around hoping that eventually he'll become the person he's been claiming to be all along. He won't. The person he actually is right now, as demonstrated by his actions, is who he is. Believe that, accept that, and decide whether that person is someone you want to continue investing your time, energy, and heart in. A gentleman, a man of true character and integrity, doesn't have a disconnect between his words and actions. He is who he says he is. He does what he says he'll do. His behavior backs up his words consistently and reliably over time. And that consistency is what builds trust, creates security, and forms the foundation for a genuine, healthy relationship. You deserve someone whose actions prove their words true every single day. Someone you don't have to make excuses for. Someone whose character is evident in their behavior, not just in their carefully crafted speeches about how wonderful they are. Don't settle for less. Your time is too valuable, and your heart deserves better than someone who treats their word as meaningless. Sign number 7. He has no empathy for your feelings or experiences. We have reached the 7th and final sign that he's not the gentleman you think he is. And this one may be the most fundamental of all. This sign is a lack of empathy for your feelings or experiences. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and to genuinely care about their emotional experience, is absolutely essential for any healthy relationship. Without it, you don't have a partnership. You have a situation where one person's feelings matter and the other person's don't. And I can tell you right now, a man without empathy is a man you cannot build a healthy, fulfilling relationship with, no matter how much he might seem like a gentleman on the surface. Let me start by distinguishing what I mean by lack of empathy, because this can manifest in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. It's not just about whether he cries at sad movies or says sympathetic things when you're upset. Some men are very good at performing empathy, saying the right words and making the right facial expressions without actually feeling or demonstrating genuine care for your emotional well-being. Real empathy goes deeper. It's reflected in how he responds when you're hurt, when you're upset, when you're going through something difficult, or when you express a need or concern. A man with genuine empathy will make your feelings a priority. He won't want you to be in pain. When you're upset, his primary concern will be understanding why and helping if he can, not defending himself, minimizing your feelings, or making it about him. He'll be able to sit with your difficult emotions without becoming defensive, angry, or dismissive. He'll recognize that your emotional experience is valid even if he doesn't fully understand it, or even if it's inconvenient for him. The man without empathy, on the other hand, treats your feelings as either irrelevant or as an imposition. When you express hurt, upset, or disappointment, his response is defensive. He immediately focuses on why you shouldn't feel that way, why your reaction is overblown, and why you're wrong to be upset. He turns it around on you. He makes himself the victim. He gets angry that you're making him feel bad by expressing your pain, or he simply dismisses your feelings as not important or not valid. Let me paint a picture of what this looks like in practice. Imagine you've had a terrible day. Maybe you received some bad news, or something happened at work, or you're dealing with a health concern or a problem with one of your children. You're upset and stressed and you need support. You reach out to him, hoping for understanding and comfort. A man with empathy will respond with concern. He'll ask what happened. He'll listen without interrupting or trying to immediately fix everything. He'll validate your feelings. He'll offer comfort or practical help. He'll make you feel like you're not alone in dealing with whatever you're facing. Even if he's busy or dealing with his own stress, he'll make time for you because he cares about your well-being. The man without empathy will respond very differently. He might be irritated that you're bringing your problems to him. He might give you a quick, dismissive solution and then change the subject. He might compare your problem to something he's dealing with and make it a competition about who has it worse. He might tell you you're overreacting or being too emotional. He might get frustrated if you don't immediately feel better after he's offered some cursory advice. Or he might simply not respond at all, ignoring your distress as if it's not his concern. This lack of empathy becomes even more evident when you're upset about something he did. This is where you see most clearly whether a man cares about your feelings or only cares about himself. When you bring up something that hurt you, something he said or did that made you feel bad, how does he respond? A man with empathy, even if he didn't intend to hurt you and even if he doesn't fully understand why what he did was hurtful, will care that you're hurting. His primary response will be concern for your pain, not defensiveness about his behavior. He'll apologize. He'll try to understand your perspective. He'll want to make it right. He'll be willing to change the behavior that caused you pain, because your well-being matters to him. The man without empathy responds to your hurt with defense, anger, or dismissal. You tell him something he did hurt you, and instead of concern for your pain, he's concerned with proving he did nothing wrong. He explains why you shouldn't be hurt. He tells you you're too sensitive. He accuses you of attacking him. He brings up things you've done wrong. He makes you feel like you're the problem for having feelings about his behavior. He might even punish you for expressing hurt by withdrawing, giving you the silent treatment, or getting angry. This pattern effectively trains you to stop expressing your feelings. You learn that being honest about when you're hurt results in conflict, defensiveness, and ultimately feeling worse rather than better. So you start swallowing your hurt. You stop bringing up issues. You convince yourself that things aren't that bad or that you're being too sensitive. You make excuses for his behavior, all because he's demonstrated that your feelings don't matter to him as much as his comfort does. Let me share Evelyn's experience because it perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Evelyn, at 65, was dating Marcus, a man she'd met through mutual friends. Marcus seemed wonderful at first, charming, articulate, and apparently caring. But early on, Evelyn noticed something concerning. One evening, Evelyn shared with Marcus that she'd received some difficult news about her sister's health. She was worried and sad, and she needed someone to talk to. Marcus listened for about 2 minutes, then said, "She'll be fine. You're worrying about nothing. Hey, did I tell you about my golf game today?" And just like that, he changed the subject to something that interested him. Completely dismissing Evelyn's worry about her sister, Evelyn felt hurt, but told herself that maybe Marcus was just trying to distract her from her worries. But the pattern continued. Whenever Evelyn was upset about something, Marcus had minimal patience for it. He'd offer a quick, dismissive solution or tell her she was overreacting, and then he'd move on to topics he cared about. Things came to a head when Evelyn told Marcus that it hurt her feelings when he cancelled their plans at the last minute, something he did frequently. Instead of apologizing or showing any concern for how this affected her, Marcus got angry. He told Evelyn she was being demanding and unreasonable. He said she knew he was busy and that things came up. He accused her of trying to control him. He said if she was going to be like this, maybe they shouldn't be together. Evelyn was stunned. She hadn't been angry or accusatory. She'd simply expressed calmly and clearly that the frequent cancellations hurt her feelings and made her feel unimportant. But Marcus's response made it clear that her feelings were an inconvenience to him, not something he cared about addressing. She realized that Marcus didn't actually care about her emotional experience at all. He was only interested in her when she was making him feel good and not causing him any discomfort by having needs or feelings of her own. This lack of empathy is sometimes most evident in how a man responds when you're dealing with something he can't personally relate to. Maybe you're going through menopause and experiencing physical and emotional symptoms. Does he educate himself about what you're experiencing and look for ways to support you? Does he show patience and understanding when you're having a difficult day? Or does he get frustrated that you're not feeling well and annoyed that it's affecting your sex life or your availability to him? Maybe you're dealing with grief, having lost someone important to you. Does he give you space to grieve? Does he understand that grief doesn't follow a timeline and that you might be sad or withdrawn at times? Or does he expect you to be over it by a certain point and get frustrated when your grief inconveniences him? Maybe you're dealing with anxiety about your adult child or grandchildren. Does he listen patiently even though they're not his family? Does he understand that your worry is valid even if he doesn't share it? Or does he dismiss your concerns as unnecessary and make you feel foolish for caring so deeply? A man's response to your struggles, especially struggles he hasn't personally experienced, reveals volumes about his capacity for empathy. A man with empathy doesn't need to have personally experienced something to care about how it's affecting you. He recognizes that your experience is valid, that your feelings matter, and that as someone who cares about you, supporting you through your struggles is part of being a good partner. The man without empathy only cares about feelings and experiences he can personally relate to. If he hasn't experienced it, it's not real or important. If it doesn't affect him directly, he has no interest in it. Your pain matters only to the extent that it impacts him or requires something from him that he doesn't want to give. Lack of empathy also shows up in a man's inability or unwillingness to recognize your needs. We all have needs in relationships. We need to feel valued, respected, heard, and cared for. We need reliability, honesty, and consideration. We need our partner to think about how their choices and actions affect us. These aren't unreasonable needs. They're basic requirements for a healthy relationship. A man with empathy recognizes and cares about your needs. He might not always meet every need perfectly because he's human, but he tries. He thinks about what you need. He asks what would help you. He adjusts his behavior when he realizes something he's doing is causing you stress or hurt. Your needs matter to him because you matter to him. The man without empathy treats your needs as demands, as attempts to control him, or as evidence of your weakness or neediness. You express a need for more communication and he tells you you're clingy. You express a need for him to be more reliable about plans and he tells you you're controlling. You express a need for more emotional intimacy and he tells you you're never satisfied. He reframes your legitimate needs as character flaws in you, rather than recognizing that caring about your partner's needs is part of being in a relationship. This lack of empathy is particularly dangerous because it makes it impossible to resolve conflicts or grow together as a couple. Healthy relationships require both people to be willing to understand each other's perspectives, to care about each other's feelings, to compromise, and to work together to address issues. None of that can happen if one person lacks empathy. When you try to address a problem and he has no empathy for how you're feeling about the situation, there's no resolution possible. He can't understand your side because he doesn't care to. He can't compromise because your needs don't matter to him. He can't change problematic behavior because he doesn't care that it's hurting you. You end up in the same conflicts over and over because he's incapable of the empathy required to actually address and resolve them. Let me be very clear about something. A man who lacks empathy for you cannot love you in any meaningful sense. He might be attracted to you. He might enjoy your company. He might like what you do for him, or how you make him feel, or what you provide for him. But he doesn't actually care about you as a person with your own inner life, your own feelings and your own experiences. You're more like an object that serves a function for him than a person he genuinely cares about. This is one of the hardest truths for many women to accept, especially mature women who've been raised to be nurturing and to believe that if they're just patient enough, loving enough, or understanding enough, they can help their partner learn to be more caring. But you cannot teach empathy to someone who doesn't have it or doesn't want to develop it. You cannot love someone into caring about your feelings if they've fundamentally decided that your feelings are not their concern. Some men lack empathy because they have narcissistic or antisocial personality traits. They're genuinely incapable of caring about others' feelings in the way that emotionally healthy people do. Other men have the capacity for empathy but have learned to turn it off when it's inconvenient for them, essentially choosing not to care about the feelings of their romantic partners even if they show empathy in other areas of their lives. In either case, the result is the same for you. You're in a relationship with someone who doesn't genuinely care about your emotional well-being, and that's not a relationship that can ever be truly fulfilling, secure, or healthy. You'll always be walking on eggshells, afraid to express your feelings. You'll always be accommodating his needs while yours go unmet. You'll always be making excuses for why he treats you with less consideration than you deserve. Here's what I want you to understand. Empathy isn't a nice extra feature in a partner. It's not a bonus quality that would be great to have, but isn't essential. Empathy is absolutely fundamental to a good relationship. Without it, everything else is just window dressing. He can open doors, bring flowers, say pretty words, and look good on paper. But if he doesn't genuinely care about your feelings and experiences, none of that matters. You're with someone who's incapable of truly being a partner to you. So how do you assess whether a man has genuine empathy? Start by paying attention to small moments. When you mention something that upsets you during your day, how does he respond? Does he care? Does he ask questions? Does he offer comfort? Or does he barely acknowledge it before moving on to something else? When you're sick or not feeling well, how does he behave? Is he concerned? Does he check on you? Does he want to help? Or is he annoyed that you're not available to him in the way he's used to? When you express a need or a concern about the relationship, how does he react? Is he willing to listen and consider your perspective? Or does he immediately get defensive and make it about him? When you're going through something difficult, does he make himself available to support you? Does he show patience with your emotions? Or does he have a limited tolerance for your struggle and expect you to get over it quickly so things can get back to normal for him? Listen to how he talks about other people's problems too. Does he show compassion for others who are struggling? Or is he generally dismissive of people's problems, suggesting that people are weak or overly dramatic when they're upset about things? And perhaps most importantly, when he does something that hurts you even unintentionally and you tell him about it, does he care that he hurt you? Does he apologize sincerely? Does he try to understand and to do better? Or does he defend himself, dismiss your hurt, or turn it around to make you the problem? These observations will tell you everything you need to know about whether this man has the capacity for the empathy that a healthy relationship requires. And if what you're seeing is a pattern of dismissiveness, defensiveness, and lack of concern for your feelings, that's not something that's going to improve. That's who he is. And no amount of time, patience, or effort on your part will turn him into someone capable of the empathy you deserve. You deserve a partner who cares deeply about your emotional well-being, who makes your feelings a priority, who wants you to be happy and at peace, who listens to you with genuine concern, who validates your experiences even when he doesn't fully understand them, and who adjusts his behavior when he learns he's hurting you. You deserve someone whose empathy for you is as natural and consistent as breathing. Don't settle for someone who treats your feelings like an inconvenience. Don't accept a relationship where your emotional needs are consistently dismissed or minimized. Don't convince yourself that you're expecting too much by wanting a partner who actually cares about how you feel. You're not expecting too much. You're expecting the bare minimum of what a loving relationship should provide. And any man who can't or won't meet that basic standard is not a gentleman. He's not someone who truly cares about you, and he's not someone you should Waste another moment of your precious life on. We've walked through 7 significant signs that the man you think is a gentleman really isn't. His chivalry is performative and conditional. He love bombs you initially and then gradually withdraws. He speaks poorly of his ex-partners and other women. He isolates you from your support system. He's financially manipulative or takes advantage. His words and actions don't align, and he has no empathy for your feelings or experiences. Each of these signs on its own is cause for serious concern. If you're seeing multiple signs, you need to honestly assess whether this relationship is healthy for you and whether this man is truly who you thought he was. I know that some of what I've shared today may have been difficult to hear. Maybe you recognized your own situation in some of these signs. Maybe you realize that the relationship you've been trying so hard to make work is with someone who isn't the gentleman you believed him to be. Maybe you're feeling disappointed, hurt, or even angry. Those feelings are all valid. They're all understandable. And I want you to know that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling right now. But I also want you to know something else. The fact that you watched this video, that you've taken in this information, and that you're now aware of these signs means something important. It means you're willing to see the truth. It means you value yourself enough to want to understand what's really happening in your relationship. It means you're strong enough to face uncomfortable realities. And that awareness, that strength, that's what's going to help you make the best decision for yourself moving forward. As mature women, we bring so much to relationships. We bring wisdom, life experience, depth, loyalty, and genuine care. We've learned who we are. We've overcome challenges. We've raised families, built careers, survived losses, and come through it all with resilience and grace. We have so much value to offer to a partner who truly appreciates us. And we absolutely deserve, to be with someone who sees that value, respects it, and treats us accordingly. Too often, mature women settle for less than we deserve because we've internalized messages that we should be grateful for any attention at our age. We've been told that the dating pool gets smaller as we get older, that we need to be less picky, and that we should be thankful if any man is interested in us. And all of that is absolutely wrong. You do not need to settle. You do not need to be grateful for breadcrumbs of respect and consideration. You do not need to accept behavior from a romantic partner that you would never accept from a friend. Your age, your life stage, none of that diminishes your worth or your right to be treated with genuine respect, care, and love. In fact, your maturity and experience make you even more deserving of a partner who's at your level, who's done his own growth work, and who has the emotional intelligence and character to truly be the gentleman he claims to be. So what should you do if you've recognized these signs in your relationship? First, trust yourself. Trust your observations. Trust the uncomfortable feelings you've been having. Trust that what you've been seeing and experiencing is real. Don't let anyone, including him, convince you that you're imagining things, overreacting, or being too demanding. Your perceptions are valid. Second, stop making excuses for him. Stop rationalizing his behavior. Stop telling yourself that he'll change or that things will get better once certain circumstances change. Accept that what you're seeing is who he is, not a temporary state that will improve once he's less stressed, once you've been together longer, or once you've proven yourself to him more. Third, get support. Talk to trusted friends or family members. If you've been isolated, reach out and rebuild those connections. Consider talking to a therapist who can help you process what you're experiencing and support you in making decisions about your relationship. Don't try to navigate this alone. Fourth, prioritize your well-being. Your peace, your happiness, and your security need to be your primary concerns. Not his feelings, not the fear of being alone, not the worry about what others will think. Your well-being comes first. Fifth, know that leaving a relationship that's not healthy at any age is an act of self-respect and courage. It's not a failure. It's not a waste of time. It's you choosing yourself, valuing yourself, and refusing to settle for less than you deserve. And that's powerful. And if you're not currently in a relationship but you're dating or considering dating, let this information arm you with awareness. Let it help you spot these red flags early before you're too emotionally invested. Let it guide you in setting standards for how you expect to be treated. Let it empower you to walk away at the first sign that someone isn't who they're presenting themselves to be. Remember, being single and at peace is infinitely better than being in a relationship with someone who doesn't truly respect and care for you. Solitude chosen from a place of self-worth is not loneliness. It's freedom. It's holding space for something genuine rather than settling for something counterfeit. There are good men out there. Men who are genuine gentlemen, not because they've perfected an act, but because of who they truly are at their core. Men who will be consistent, honest, empathetic, and respectful. Men who will enhance your life rather than diminish it. Men who will see your value and treat you accordingly every single day. You deserve nothing less than that. As we close, I want to remind you again to please support this channel if you found this video helpful. Hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your experiences. Your engagement helps this content reach more women who need to hear this message. Share this video with the women in your life who might benefit from understanding these signs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future content. And if you're able, consider supporting the channel with super thanks. Your contribution helps us continue creating content that empowers women with the truth they need to make informed decisions about their relationships and their lives. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for caring enough about yourself to seek out this information.
Thank you for your courage in facing what might be difficult truths. Thank you for being part of this community of women who support and uplift each other. Remember, you are valuable. You are worthy. You deserve genuine love, respect, and care. Don't settle for anything less. Don't waste your precious time on men who aren't worthy of you. Trust yourself, value yourself, and never, ever compromise on your worth. Until next time, take care of yourself. Be strong, be wise, and remember that the right person will make you feel cherished, not confused. The right person will add to your life, not complicate it. The right person won't make you question your worth. They'll remind you of it every single day. Stay strong, stay wise, and remember that you deserve the very best. I'll see you in the next video. Dorothy didn't mind at all. She paid for dinner, and Richard was appropriately grateful and even embarrassed. But the next several times they went out, similar situations arose. His bank card wasn't working. He'd forgotten his wallet. His check hadn't cleared yet. There was always a reason. Dorothy found herself consistently paying for their dates, for groceries when he came over, and for the vacation they took together. Then Richard started asking for larger amounts. He needed a short-term loan to cover a gap before his big deal closed. It was just for a week or two, and he'd pay her back with interest. Dorothy hesitated, but Richard made her feel like she didn't trust him, like she didn't believe in him, like she wasn't being a supportive partner. She lent him the money. Of course, the big deal never closed. There was always another delay, another complication, another reason why he couldn't pay her back. Meanwhile, he continued to present himself as successful, to talk about his financial projects, and to maintain the image of being a man of means, even as he was systematically draining Dorothy's savings. By the time Dorothy realized what was happening and extracted herself from the relationship, she had lost over $30,000. Richard had never had any intention of paying her back. His stories about his business success were largely fabricated. He targeted mature women with financial resources, presented himself as successful to gain their trust, and then systematically exploited them financially. Dorothy wasn't his first victim, and she likely wasn't his last. This pattern of financial manipulation often includes several warning signs. Let me walk through them so you know what to watch for. First, there's an inconsistency between his lifestyle and his apparent means. He talks about being financially successful, but somehow never seems to have money available when it's needed. He drives a nice car, but claims he can't afford to pay for dinner. He wears expensive clothes, but needs to borrow money for rent. The image doesn't match the reality. Second, there's a pattern of financial emergencies or temporary problems. There's always a reason why he needs money right now, and it's always supposedly temporary. But the temporary problems never seem to resolve. There's always another emergency, another delay, another complication. If you're constantly hearing about financial crises that require your assistance, that's a major red flag. Third, he pressures you or manipulates you emotionally when you're hesitant to help financially. A man with integrity will understand if you're not comfortable lending money or paying for things. He won't make you feel guilty. He won't question your feelings for him. He won't accuse you of not being supportive. But the financial manipulator will use every emotional tool at his disposal to overcome your resistance. He'll make you feel like you're being unreasonable, unloving, or distrustful. Fourth, he's vague or evasive about his actual financial situation. If you ask direct questions about his finances, he deflects, changes the subject, or gives non-answers. He doesn't want you to understand his real financial situation because if you did, you'd realize he's not who he's presented himself to be. Fifth, promises to pay you back are never kept, or there's always an excuse for the delay. This is perhaps the clearest sign. One broken promise to pay you back might be legitimate, but a pattern of broken promises is intentional. He has no intention of paying you back. He's just saying what he needs to say to get you to give him money. Sixth, he starts pushing for access to your accounts or assets. He might suggest you add him to your bank account for convenience. He might propose that you buy a house together with your down payment. He might encourage you to make him a beneficiary on your accounts or your insurance. Any man who pushes for legal or practical access to your assets early in a relationship is waving a giant red flag, another form of financial manipulation that's particularly relevant for mature women involves inheritance, estates, and long-term financial planning. Some manipulative men specifically target older women with assets or expected inheritances. They rush the relationship toward marriage or cohabitation with the goal of gaining legal rights to your property and estate. This is where things can get truly dangerous. I've heard stories of women who've been convinced to change their wills, to add a new partner as a beneficiary, to put property in joint names, or to make other significant financial decisions that benefit a man they've only known for a short time. Then, after these changes are made, the man's behavior shifts dramatically, or in the worst cases, the woman suffers suspicious health problems or accidents. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I am trying to be realistic. There are people in this world who view mature women with assets as targets. They calculate that you're vulnerable to loneliness, that you want companionship, and that you might be willing to overlook red flags because you don't want to be alone. They use romance as a weapon to access your resources, and they have absolutely no genuine feelings for you. So how do you protect yourself? How do you differentiate between a man who's genuinely experiencing temporary financial difficulty and someone who's deliberately taking advantage of you? Here are some guidelines. First, a man of character will be upfront about his financial situation. He won't inflate his success or his wealth. He'll be honest about what he can and can't afford. He won't create a false impression to make himself seem more successful than he is. Second, a real gentleman will never ever expect you to regularly pay for him or support him financially. If he encounters genuine financial difficulty, he'll be deeply uncomfortable accepting help, and he'll do everything in his power to repay you and to not need help again. Third, a good man will respect your financial boundaries. If you say you're not comfortable lending money or making a particular financial decision, he'll accept that without pressure, guilt trips, or manipulation. Your financial security will matter to him because you matter to him. Fourth, a man worth your time will want to contribute equally to the relationship. He'll want to pay his fair share. He'll want to treat you. He'll take pride in being able to provide for himself and contribute to your shared experiences. He won't want to be carried by you financially. Fifth, a genuine partner will keep his promises. If he says he'll pay you back, he will. If he can't for some legitimate reason, he'll communicate clearly about it and will make a concrete plan with you. Most importantly, a real gentleman will encourage you to maintain your financial independence and security. He will never pressure you to make financial decisions that could jeopardize your well-being. He will never rush you into financial entanglements. He will respect that your financial resources are yours, built over a lifetime, and essential to your security. Let me give you some practical advice for protecting yourself financially in new relationships. First, keep your finances completely separate in the early stages of a relationship.
Don't share account information.
Don't add anyone to your accounts. Don't give anyone access to your credit cards or your assets. Don't discuss the specific details of your financial situation, your assets, or your estate planning with someone you haven't known for a substantial period of time. Second, if a man asks you for money, even a small amount, be very cautious. While there might be legitimate circumstances where this is appropriate, it should be rare and he should be uncomfortable asking. Pay attention to whether this becomes a pattern. Third, never lend money you can't afford to lose, and always treat a loan as a gift in your mind. If you do decide to lend money despite red flags, assume you'll never see it again. If you can't afford to lose it, don't lend it, period. Fourth, be extremely wary of any man who pressures you to make significant financial decisions quickly. Whether it's buying property together, changing your will, investing in his business venture, or anything else substantial, legitimate financial decisions can wait. Rush is a red flag. Fifth, consult with trusted advisors about significant financial decisions. Before you make any major financial move involving a new partner, talk to your financial advisor, your lawyer, or your accountant. Get objective professional advice. And if the man you're dating has a problem with you seeking professional advice about financial decisions, that itself is a red flag. Sixth, trust your instincts. If something feels off about his financial situation or his request for money, honor that feeling. Don't let him talk you out of your gut sense that something isn't right. Remember, your financial security represents much more than just money. It represents your independence, your ability to support yourself, your future, your legacy for your children or grandchildren, and the result of years or decades of hard work. You have an obligation to yourself to protect it. No man, no matter how charming, how romantic, or how much he claims to love you, has a right to jeopardize your financial well-being. And any man who tries to is not a gentleman. He's a user at best and a predator at worst. You deserve a partner who brings his own financial stability to the relationship, who respects your financial independence, who would never dream of taking advantage of you, and who wants you to maintain the security you've worked so hard to build. Don't settle for anything less. Sign number 6, his words and actions don't align.